aha, now we know why the feminists are winning. The feminists are winning for this reason. The reason is all these men are finding reasons not to work with other people. And what came to mind was that wonderful scene in The Life of Brian with the Judean Liberation Front hating the People's Front for the Liberation of Judea.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like, oh my God, it's just ordinary sectarianism. It's just ordinary fundamentalism.
Hello, and welcome to the show where I try and make a little sense out of this stunning and increasingly brave new world that we all live in by talking to a series of expert witnesses about their experiences, interests, and concerns. And today I'm talking to Mike Bell, curator of the Equalogist and creator of the Equi-Law Uk project. For the uninitiated, the Equalogist is a monthly e-zine which provides free edited highlights of developments in UK men's issues, and Equi-Law UK is a watchdog which aims to promote gender parity in UK law, highlighting gaps in existing law and failures in implementation that currently adversely impact on boys and men. Mike is also heavily involved in an exciting new initiative called Gender Parity UK, which he will also talk about, so there will be plenty of links for you to investigate in the show notes. In today's discussion, Mike talks about why he believes that political lobbying can ultimately lead to positive change. We also discuss his sometimes frustrating experience of attempting to develop links and networks within the men's rights movement. But I begin by asking Mike what compelled him to set up the Equi-Law project in the first place.
What happened to me was much less traumatic than what happened to a lot of men. You know, I've heard some really horrific stories since, but I had a number of incidents with women that I knew, and I was, as a result of two of them happening at the same time, I hit a really heavy depression, really quite suicidal. But I knew that it was, for me, it was going to be something temporary. But I was kind of lying in bed at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I thought, all these things make sense if these women can't feel empathy for me. And I thought, well, that's a ridiculous idea, because we know that women are better at empathy than men. So I sort of got up at 5 o'clock in the morning and Googled it, women not feeling empathy for men, and found the empathy gap. Michael Collins and whatever, and I found a red pill movie, and it was like I had a red pill moment on the red pill movie. You know what I mean? It's like, oh my God, the world's actually different than the way I thought it was, and because of that, you sort of, one's life flashes before one, if you know what I mean. Yeah. And I saw things in a different way, and I've always been a bit of a campaigner. In the past, I was an environmental campaigner, but more recently, I mean, not exactly as a campaigner, but you know, I became a teacher, and then I found out about evidence-based teaching, and I get quite sort of, you know, get fired up by these things and try to organise them. So it's something that I've done in the past in different ways, is to organise something. And the first thing that struck me was that the facts were not all drawn together in one place in a simple form. I think partly because I'm mildly dyslexic. I like to see things in simple terms. I like lists. I like to write a list and then say what's wrong with this list, rather than writing a long article, if you know what I mean. So I started to create the lists, and then thought, well, this would make a website. So again, probably 5 o'clock in the morning, the idea of calling it Equi-Law came in, and the idea that it was just focused on making laws fair. You know what I mean? And so I built that from there. Um, the other thing that I noticed from my past experience, I mean, you know, when I was in the Green Movement, we had a magazine. We had something that everybody read.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, back in the last century, you'd pay a subscription and you get a monthly piece of paper, you know, and then, but that had obviously changed. And the other thing that I'd done was I'd been part of a meditation group, and I'd organised a mailing list for that, just sending out a mailing every 6 weeks, and I built that up to 3,500, which I thought was quite good. And I'd done a similar thing in education. I just found teachers who are interested in evidence-based teaching and built that up to about 7,000 mailing. So it's a sort of a feeling that you can't, a movement can't move and without a medium, if you know what I mean. And even today, we lack what you might call the medium of the movement, something which tells you, you know, not everything that's going on, but more or less everything that's going on.
Regularly kind of sort of joining the dots and having a kind of mailing list where people can find out about other people's work. You know, that's obviously a kind of very valuable thing that I saw with that. Just to go back, can I ask you, kind of, when you were saying about sort of that red pill moment and the empathy gap, and you know, I think you said there was like two particular females had in some way contributed to you thinking about that. Was that sort of, if you don't mind me asking, you know, was that sort of leveled at sort of just their attitudes to men generally, or was it, you know, kind of more, you know, specific to yourself in terms of kind of, you know, a relationship or, you know, sort of thing?
It's difficult to say without perhaps giving away too much, you know, private information.
Please, tell me my business.
I've been working with a number of women on a project, and I was part of a committee, you know, in this big organisation, voluntary organisation, and I noticed that you know, 3 or 4 men from that committee had resigned before, and eventually I resigned because it was impossible.
Okay.
And then I contacted these men who had given kind of neutral reasons for resigning, like I don't have the time or whatever it is, and actually found they all had the same story, that the women were impossible, that they just kept going on and on and on to get their own way. And somebody said women can, I can't remember, it's a lovely little phrase, women can act as men, but they can't be gentlemen. And that was, I mean, that was not traumatic, but it was like, oh my God, you know, I've done my best to be the good male feminist. You know, I haven't tried to dominate the meeting. I've, you know, asked for your opinion and taken you seriously, and treated, I felt respect and treated you with respect, and it actually hasn't had any effect. You know, it's like, maybe I should have been more of a man. You know, that's a sort of, you know, maybe you would have respected me if I'd actually been what you say you don't want me to be.
Okay. And that's like traits like assertiveness and...
Yeah. But at the same time, I was in a relationship with a woman who seemed unable to see the effect on me of what she did. That is, we would plan to do something and then she would just change the plan, but she wouldn't say, you know, Mike, I know we were going to get together this weekend, but Mum's ill, so I really do need to sort of, you know, go and see her. Would you mind if? It was sort of, well, we were going to get together this weekend, but now I've said I'm going to do so and so.
Okay.
And this just went on and on and on. And then when I sort of finally confronted her, she sort of says, well, you know, any pain you experience is your own affair. And I was absolutely stunned. I mean, when she said that, I stood there in the street shaking, because I just couldn't believe that this person was saying this to me. Now, this is nowhere near the trauma of other men, you know, losing their house and family and, you know, everything.
Sure. But yeah, it's kind of both. It's kind of, you know, you're describing sort of someone being very thoughtless in that, and kind of pushing the outcome of any thoughtlessness as to, well, that's your problem, basically. But kind of,
yes, it's like what I felt that seemed to count as nothing.
Yeah.
In that matter, you know, that's what.
Yeah, well, that's certainly unfortunate, and that committee. I mean, was that sort of? I mean, what were you encountering specific attitudes towards men in terms of how men were treated on the that committee, or sort of in terms of the view of kind of how? Well, you know, I suppose kind of what I'm possibly getting at is that there's so much focus on discrimination experienced by women that sometimes there's this lack of belief that it's even possible for men to be discriminated. Were you kind of coming across that sort of attitude?
Well, what I would say is that in those circles there was no feminist ideological language, but it seemed to be subconscious.
Okay.
That is, what they were doing was not, they weren't conscious of what they were doing. And I suppose that's why I think a lot of men in the movement are quite angry towards women. But to me, it seems that what we're all experiencing is a kind of almost subliminal culture, and young women are picking up on it. Not, you know, like you might be born into a Buddhist society or a Muslim society. You just grow up with this stuff, and you don't know that that's what you think. And I think that this anti-male narrative is so ingrained in society that it just pops up without anybody, you know, nobody has to read a feminist book. It's just there all the time.
That sort of embedded culture is so embedded that kind of most men would kind of view the world that way also, because it's kind of the way we're brought up, and it's until, you know, so you know, kind of
that's certainly, you know, I would have called myself a feminist until 3 or 4 years ago. It's just like I thought feminism was about equality. I thought it was about women having equal chances to get to university and have the job. But, you know, and I worked in education. I worked in the science department, and, you know, more than half the staff are female, and many of them are absolutely brilliant. You know, I never thought, you know, women teachers are worse than men. You know, it's just a ridiculous statement.
So that's it. And, you know, it seems obvious that kind of more men are ultimately going to kind of experience that red pill movement, because, you know, kind of, you know, I've experienced that as well. That sort of, well, this is actually kind of quite a negative view of my sex. So, you know, it's hard not to take that personally. But the thing in terms of legislation is, as you're kind of sort of, you know, as you kind of were pointing to in that talk, which I'll leave a link to, was that, well, when you stop to think about it, if you're a decent human being, this does actually start to unravel, because we don't have the same rights in certain areas, and you particularly see the kind of the linkages between the likes of the huge number of men who are tragically killing themselves, and the links to the likes of family court outcomes, the likes, the, you know, kind of long-term unemployment numbers, those sort of factors, that there isn't the same level of empathy, and it's not really looked at. So do you want to say a bit about sort of, I mean, you were saying about that list that you sort of, you know, sat down and started writing a list of, am I right in thinking, kind of particularly in terms of the legislation, what the gaps were? Is that right?
Yes, it turns out that there are about half a dozen laws which directly discriminate against men. They're mostly to do with paternity.
Sure.
But very soon, William Collins pointed out to me when I was trying, tapping him for information, he said, the most important thing is not those 6 laws, it's the other dozen laws where the implementation of the law is discriminatory.
Yeah.
Clearly I could pull the page up and go through some of them, but maybe people would like to look for themselves. And then as I was creating the list, an example of that would be sentencing, for instance.
Yeah.
It's not that the law doesn't state that men should get 3 times the prison sentence that a woman gets for the same offence. But so it's the implementation of the law. It doesn't say that in the law. And then there are other areas. So my third list was just things in society, which, like boys underachieving in school. That's neither to do with the law nor the implementation of the law. That's something that's emerged as a result of this whole package of anti-male cultural events, if you know what I mean. So one of the first things I did was I realized that there was this domestic abuse bill coming up.
Yeah.
And I contacted Mark Brooks at the Mankind Initiative, and I contacted a number of different people, some of whom said to me, whatever I proposed, they said it was a waste of time and had been tried before.
Yeah.
Which I found, well, I didn't agree with them,
Yeah.
If you were selling a new product and you advertised it once, and it didn't sell, you'd be a fool to think that it wouldn't sell. So to say that you've written to your MP once and they didn't respond positively, well, of course they didn't respond positively. It takes them ages, takes anybody ages to absorb some new ideas. And I was actually quite helped by some advice from my father, who was a Church of England minister. He was talking about how you get ideas across in any organisation. He said he said that you had to arrange it so that the bishop could think that it was his idea.
Okay.
And then it would be implemented. If you kept pushing it as your own idea, then you might just meet resistance. But if you could just throw the idea out and wait, maybe the bishop will pick it up. And I think the same with politics is that when you first write to your MP, of course they send this sort of bland kind of manufactured reply, but maybe they think about it. Maybe next week something happens.
Yeah. If enough people write to the MP as well, and to enough MPs as well, then there begins to be a bit of momentum as well. So I guess that's another aspect of it.
Yeah, I think that people have got the wrong idea about MPs. Because MPs are enacting these laws, which are part of the anti-male narrative, they think that the MPs are anti-male. But of course they're not. The MPs are just humans who are caught up in the system. And of course, in order to get elected, they have to say popular things. So it's like they have their little antennae out as to what people are thinking.
Yeah.
Well, if no men ever say, I'm a victim of domestic abuse, or what are you doing about male suicide? If nobody ever says anything, why would they even ever think of it? So the first thing I did was Mark Brooks said, could you look through the media coverage of the launch of the bill, see whether it's biased or not? And I looked through it. Absolutely everybody, Telegraph, BBC, Sun, about 15 of them, newspapers and news outlets, every single one of them was assumed that domestic abuse was something which happened against women. And only the BBC website showed the percentage of male victims. I thought, well, that's really interesting, because that shows how deeply ingrained this idea is. It's not because, if all the newspapers of whatever persuasion are saying the same thing, that's a bit like the Soviet Union, isn't it? It's like, it's so ingrained.
Yeah.
That's interesting. The fact that all the news, left and right newspapers, all think the same thing. Wow, that's odd.
It is. And I would suggest it. I mean, it is complex, and that I can completely understand that cynicism and I've seen that myself, where people saying there's no point in writing to your MP, or there's no point in kind of getting involved in public consultations and sort of or kind of doing petitions and stuff, and to a degree. I can understand that, and people have had negative experiences of that. But the other aspect of it is that there are complexities. To my mind, the reason an MP wouldn't respond in any sort of substantial way could be because they're afraid of being shamed publicly, which is the likes of Philip Davis has experienced. Because they don't understand the issues and haven't looked into it. A key one is there aren't really many votes in men's rights in the same way, sort of almost instinctually, throughout history, our instinct is to look after women and children, and that sort of does.
Yes. On the other hand, Philip Davis has been quite outspoken.
Yes.
And one might even say, he hasn't shied away from confrontation. I mean, he hasn't been confrontational, but he hasn't been mealy-mouthed about it.
No.
And yet, he gets re-elected, and when he got re-elected, he got a majority the same, an increased majority, the same as other MPs got. That Absolutely. Is, people in his constituency are not going, this man is awful, we're not going to vote for him. Yeah. There's only a small number of very vocal people, some of them in Parliament, who are on some kind of ideological trip. Yeah. The vast majority of people, you walk down the street and ask people, are you a feminist? They'd go, yes. And what they mean is, well, I thought I meant, let's have fair shares kind of thing. And they've been fed this constant diet of, kind of 2 women a week, or overwhelming majority of domestic abuses against women. That's another thing I'm working on at the moment with the team is myths. There are about, I don't know, a dozen major myths which support this anti-male narrative. Well, we don't even have to be, I can't think. We don't have to express a pro-male point of view, opinion, in order to counter the myths. The myths are untrue.
Yeah.
The facts do not support them. Any independent researcher would find them to be wrong. And what we're finding is if you appeal to the Office of National Statistics, they will agree that it is not the vast majority of women. It's not the overwhelming majority. And they, and as again, Mark Brooks has found, he's got the Home Office to withdraw the word vast from majority.
Yes.
In the guidance to the bill, so things can be done. I mean, the people in the Home Office and the people in the Statistics Office are not radical feminist, awful people who are trying to kill us.
Yeah.
They're just ordinary people caught up in the same narrative who, when asked a straight question like, is it the vast majority of women? The answer is no. Our figures suggest about 65% women.
Yeah.
That's not the vast majority.
And so things like that they're very significant. They may seem like tiny victories along the way, but they start to add up, which I think is kind of your philosophy.
Yeah, I think that the anti-male narrative is supported by this, 10, 20 myths. If you dismantle the myths, the anti-male narrative falls apart. That is, it's a bit like communism. People think that this this feminist, or I'll call it anti-male narrative culture, is so ingrained, so powerful. And it is, it's in all the universities and in all the newspapers and whatever. But, the Berlin Wall fell down because when things are based on nonsense, they fall apart. The Soviets could carry on again and again telling their people, that theirs is the best system. And everybody knew that it was a lie, That people in West Germany had an income 3 times as big as those in East Germany. I mean, it just fell apart in the end because it was.
And when it fell, it fell very quickly. One of the things I was going to say about one of the things I really, kind of like about the Equi-Law project, kind of you're making the point that, kind of most policymakers and lawmakers and MPs are not radical man-hating feminists. But the other side of that coin, they're just out. Most people are just decent human beings that sort of want the best for men and women, kind of boys and girls. The other aspect of that is because we do have equality law that's kind of been in the statute since the 1970s, and at this stage, kind of requires particularly kind of public bodies, when they're spending public money, to ensure that they're not discriminating. All those people's job descriptions actually include a responsibility that they, should not be discriminating. So whenever, if you want to maybe say a little bit about sort of, Equi-Law's aim in terms of kind of then encouraging lobbying to consultations and such, it's, the quotes that you said at that Messages for Men meeting struck me very much. That sort of, what is it? It's when the only thing that needs.
Oh yeah. Well, there's a quote, I can't remember where it comes from, where the only thing needed for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing. Well, okay, I wouldn't quite class it as evil. But the only thing needed for the anti-male narrative to continue is for good men to do nothing, and that is precisely what we're doing. Nothing.
Yeah, and the more people stand up and sort of just purely question it and ask our policymakers to question it.
Well, let me give you an example. I was new to the men's rights movement, and some people are around it years and years. So the select committee for the domestic abuse bill met, I think it was, last February, March time, I think. And there's an invitation to put in written submissions. So I put one in, and then you get the list of people who've written in. And so another little job I did for Mark Brooks was just to go through them and see which are pro-male, which are anti-male, and which are nothing to do with it at all. And a lot of them were to nothing to do with it at all. But there were 3 contributions, pro-male contributions. One of them was mine. Yeah. That's weird. I mean, I'm even new to this. I don't know much about it. I've got 1/3 of the submissions. The second was from one of those wonderful female academics from up in the north west. Name I can't quite remember at the moment, but they've done some brilliant research on male victims and what have you. And I think the third was Mankind.
Okay.
And I thought, well, this is the and then there are 20 different female organisations sending in written submissions, all beautifully prepared. You're thinking, well, you're just asking to be walked on if you don't even bother to write to the committee. And then the next thing you discover is only pro-female and pro-female people have been invited to speak to the committee. Well, I still haven't got to the bottom of, or not I, but we haven't got to the bottom of how this has come about.
Yeah.
But just to give you an example of, again, the sort of whole cultural bias, the bill came up to the Commons earlier this summer, and there was a second committee called the Scrutiny Committee, and only female people were invited to speak to the committee.
It was 7 different groups, wasn't it? I think it was 7 different groups representing
Well, I wanted to know why this was the case.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that I did, which illustrates how open people are, is I ended up having a conversation with one of the government ministers, Andrew Bowie, who responded to an email. I mean, we sent an email in saying, thank you for mentioning men in this committee.
Yeah.
And he said, oh, I'll give you a call next Friday. And I'm thinking, and he's talking to me like I'm somebody of, some vague importance. He's not talking down to me. And what he explained is that each of the political parties was invited to nominate somebody to speak to the committee. And every single political party invited a pro-female speaker. That is, there wasn't a great feminist conspiracy. It was so ingrained in the culture that that's what they all did.
Yeah, I suppose the one thing, my one observation on that, because it would make sense that sort of, most of the political parties are going to say, well, who are the large domestic abuse providers, and they are all the likes of Women's Aid and Refuge, etc. Mm-hmm. But for that committee not to then observe the obvious, that, well, hang on a minute, I mean, even before we get into men, there were no LGBT groups represented. Mm-hmm. And usually, kind of there is more lip service and respect and understanding of the dynamics of different groups. So, I thought that particularly jumped out as well. That's kind of for 33% at least of victims to be male, and it not even occurred to them to, ensure that at least one group. So, I think it says something about the attitude of the people on the committee as well, because some of them, I would argue, would be, kind of very politically viewed in terms of their, like, the Duluth model. Some of them are very much bought into the gender, violence narrative.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, odd individuals like Jess Phillips are incredibly one-sided, incredibly effective, in terms of as an operator in the House of Commons. She's one of the most effective people I've seen, and I've seen quite a few.
Particularly in that area, yeah. She's very well connected to the lobby, yeah.
Very well briefed, very well organised, has very clear, her mind is clear, and she speaks clearly, and on and on and on and on, almost in a filibuster.
Yeah, and overtly bigoted, which is the remarkable thing. It's so that's the thing with Jess Phillips that fascinates me. She at the minute has the gall to be promoting a campaign about leave no victim behind, and kind of support for all kind of exclamation mark victims of domestic abuse. But she means all women, all female victims, and it's set out very clearly in the documentation. It's shocking.
Yeah, but I do think this sort of non-empathy for men is so ingrained. I mean, obviously, the human race has evolved to actually not be too upset when men die.
Yeah,
that for the human race to succeed, the most important people are the fertile females and the children.
Yeah.
If some men die, that's not a huge threat. Just the remaining men get more females, if you know what I mean. So there's that, but it's been amplified by this anti-male narrative in the last half century, that somehow or other we're now white males are the awful people who've oppressed everybody in the world, including the world.
Yeah.
So it's hard to counter. But just for an example, I have two daughters, and I was talking to one of them when I was first introduced to these ideas, and she did the normal mildly feminist response. Quite upset and what have you. A couple of years on, I was just having a conversation a couple of weeks ago, and she said, it's amazing. Once you start to notice, they do only go on about female victims. It is amazing, the bias, isn't it, Dad? I'm going, yes, it's amazing. But you see, unless I would say that I can't quite think. Is she an average person? No, I should think she's probably a bit more feminist than the average. But she comes around with no trouble. And when I started Equi-Law, I sent an email to a niece of mine who is probably a bit feminist, reasonably feminist as well. She said, are you now working for Equi-Law? And I said, well, not working for, but she said, oh, we should be able to have some good arguments then next time we meet. So I replied saying, have a look on the website and tell me which bits you disagree with. Yeah. And guess what the result was?
Silence.
She didn't reply. That is, I had another female friend who was ranting on about something or other. I'd been going on about this. She said, yes, women's movement has made huge strides, Mike, but there is so far to go. There's so much further to go. I'm saying, like what?
Yeah.
And she changed the subject. It's just this big myth painted in the subconscious mind of the majority of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing, is sort of like individuals can experience challenges in their lives, and kind of I certainly wouldn't go as far as to think that sort of there are, clearly there are issues that are more or sometimes entirely unique to women, and I think kind of like pregnancy discrimination is probably a very good example of something that is still an issue, and probably will be for a very long time. But that that's in terms of kind of all of the grand things in terms of rights and in terms of kind of what's enshrined in legislation. When you set the lists out in order and looking at it in detail, you do find that men actually surprisingly have significantly less rights than women. And that and the narrative is more complicated as well, because certainly, one of the eye openers for myself, and I think many other people, is that concept of, well, it's only 100 years since women had the vote, and then you look at that in more detail and say, well, that's kind of slightly more complicated. It's not much longer that most men had the votes, and most men were only given the votes because they had to commit to going to war, and potentially kind of giving their life to their country. So these things are slightly more nuanced, and it's not some grand patriarchal. That our generations of grandfathers wanted to have power and control over the female sex. So.
Yes, I mean, that's one of the myths that we've started to write up, the myth that the suffragettes got women the vote, and that they needed to be militant because men were opposed to it.
Yeah.
It turns out to be entirely incorrect. I mean, the House of Commons had a significant majority in favour of votes for women, I think, but certainly by 1910. And the only reason it didn't was because the Liberal Party, who were in government, had a majority of one.
Yeah.
And they thought that because the women campaigners wanted votes for women who owned property, that is, at the time, only men who owned property had the vote as well, they calculated that the new women's votes would give the Conservatives more votes and they would lose out. So that wasn't men or the patriarchy, it was, a political expediency.
Yeah.
And
these things are ignored. The kind of the suffragette movement, and particularly kind of some of its leaders like Millicent Fawcett, would have been kind of lobbying for votes for women, but for votes for women like them.
Yes.
Not necessarily for the young girls down the mill who might vote in a different direction, and these things do get completely overlooked. Yeah.
Plus, of course, we can see that the votes for women all across the Anglosphere, Australia or Canada or the United States. All these places got votes for women around about the same time. I think New Zealand was earlier.
Yeah.
And none of them needed to be militant. So I blame it on Mary Poppins, you know.
Yes, I don't think there's feminist movement's particularly keen on Mary Poppins either, though. I think they kind of make the suffragettes look something not unlike they possibly were. But listen, I mean, I suppose the question would be, in terms of the aims for Equi-Law, and I mean, you may want to broaden this out, because I know kind of, you're becoming involved in a lot more partnership working, but the Equi-Law aim was particularly around lobbying and legislation. Is that right? Do you want to just maybe say what the aim of it was?
Well, I mean, almost literally, in the first place, simply to create a list,
okay,
so that you could refer to it. It's like, I think websites have now become the equivalent of the pamphlet.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean. So, and it's like an editable pamphlet. So you could say, if you're interested, have a look on this page. One of the aims, of course, is to lobby Parliament and engage with the media and what have you. And of course, it's very, very difficult to get volunteers to do this. When you try to rally volunteers, often it takes longer to rally them than to do it yourself. So learning from my previous campaigning experience, what I plan to do is to raise some funds for, not quite an office, but somebody who will work for a few hours a week, so that we can maintain the momentum on this.
Okay.
And my first attempt, just writing to a small number of people who I thought might have some money, I did get a couple of donations, which led to a few £100s. So that's a place to start. But over the winter, I hope to raise enough funds for somebody to come in or to work from home, say 2 mornings a week or something like that.
Okay.
So that we can really keep the pressure up. I mean, we need to really know what's happening in Parliament. We need to maintain this database of people who are prepared to write to their MP. That's going to be quite a lot of work. And also, we've set up some Google alerts, so that we can see when articles come up, say, on domestic abuse, and see how gendered they are and write to the journalists. That again requires a sort of office approach. So come in on Tuesday and what's been in the media this week, and what letter do we send out. So hopefully people might be prepared to chip in on that, if you're happy to add the link. And then you wanted to know about how Gender Parity UK fits in with all this.
Yes.
Well, Gender Parity UK is just a network of people who get together, mostly on a Zoom call on a Sunday, to hear what each other are doing, hear what's happening, and learn from each other and help each other, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So it does have its own Twitter account, and I think we may be working on a Facebook account. And in a way, the Equalogist is the newsletter of Gender Parity UK. So we're using the term gender parity, more widely.
Okay.
So that, for instance, we may discuss what we're going to do in response to something that's happening in Parliament in that group, but then decide to send the letter from Equi-Law UK, because Equi-Law is the bit that deals with the law.
Yeah.
Or somebody might tell us that there is a march happening or an event happening, or and we can advertise that in the Equalogist. So it's just part of the ecosystem, I think. I think this is what the women manage to do, is they get together, and when you watch these women on the committee, they haven't just come in there unprepared. They're not all saying the same thing because they happen to be all saying the same thing. They've been working on this, and they cooperate. And You know, they are a highly publicly funded lobby group, and they work really effectively. And you get two men together, you know, men are very competitive, and they always want to be the winner, if you know what I mean. So I see this in the men's movement, you know, people don't like to work together. They like to do their own thing. And so I've been looking around for people who do want to work together a bit, and I have found the odd individual, like Philip Tanzer started United for Men, and Stephen Fitzgerald started Men and Women Working Together. I mean, Stephen's a remarkable character, having started Mankind 20 years ago and then gone out of the movement, and then come back realizing that it's worse than it was 20 years ago. And wanting to do something about it, and then other individuals like Belinda Brown, for instance, you know, people who want to, I don't know, pull together as a team. So I'm just following wherever that goes, you know, like sort of picking up on the energy, like agreeing to do a video with Glass Blind Spot, you know, and so I don't have a mega plan. It's like, let's just put out some feelers and see where things are going.
Yeah, I mean, I completely relate to the kind of do something, and I guess, you know, I understand to a certain extent. I'm kind of reasonably optimistic about some of the initiatives that are out there, including your own, and knowing, you know, kind of what Philip Tanzer's been involved in, you know, and, you know, there is very much, there are a lot of people that do want to kind of work together. I dig, you know, I understand the cynicism. I've seen that quite recently in terms of, you know, kind of talking about a new project, and you know, kind of people can be very suspicious, I think. And I get that to a certain extent. There's a view that you know, kind of feminists are increasingly encroaching into the area of men's rights to try and dominate it in the same way that I suppose, you know, they kind of dominated to a certain extent domestic violence services that are available to men that are funded publicly. But yes, you know, kind of I guess that, you know, I guess that's one thing, is kind of like, you've got to, if it instinctively feels right to do something, then it's not very helpful if people are telling you don't do that, but they're not giving you an alternative option, if that makes sense. What I mean, what's your experience of kind of when people have said sort of, you know, negatively, you know, kind of, have they then given any reason for that negativity, or I mean, do you think it's just that sort of competitive aspect you mentioned?
I don't know fully, but for instance, when I started to advertise the Equalogist, I contacted all sorts of organizations, hoping that they would go, oh yes, that's a good idea. And one organization told me, the individual, you know, running it, said, I don't want anything to do with it, this is Equalogist, because you're not overtly anti-feminist, and I am.
Okay.
And I went to another large organization who I thought might back the issue, and initially they showed some interest. And, you know, a couple of weeks later, they say, we've spoken to the committee and we're all agreed that we want nothing to do with you because you include information about anti-feminist organizations, and we don't agree with it. You know, it's like, aha, now we know why the feminists are winning. The feminists are winning for this reason. The reason is all these men are finding reasons not to work with other people. And what came to mind was that wonderful scene in The Life of Brian with the Judean Liberation Front hating the People's Front for the Liberation of Judea. Yeah. You know, and it's like, oh my God, it's just ordinary sectarianism. It's just ordinary fundamentalism.
Yeah.
It's like,
I mean, I perhaps wouldn't be quite as generous to feminism in the sense that obviously they have their sects as well, and you're seeing that very much in terms of the transgender debate, which is literally turned into a turf war. Excuse the pun, but I would certainly, have observed that, and particularly, I suppose the project that I've kind of slowly developed, and I kind of started with a feeling of, okay, I want to do something, and I want to do something that's helpful, and then it comes down to, well, what are my skill sets, and how much time can I give and such. And one of the things I've been very keen to interview people from across the spectrum and not get into, my politics aren't necessarily going to agree with everybody, and that's fine, because you want to encourage discussion. I have certainly seen there's a kind of almost like a good MRA, bad MRA sort of split developing in terms of where there's been some progress in the more kind of mainstream area. Some people are then reluctant to engage with people who are maybe more frank or vocal about their political beliefs. And I think that, that thing about anti-feminism, as you say, that anti-feminism is not something I particularly really buy into, because I just don't see it as relevant. I sort of, it's just my perspective. Well, it's not that it's not relevant, but it's my perspective on it is pro-libertarianism is the direction I like to look at things. I like to move forward towards something than away from something. But I entirely respect people who describe themselves as anti-feminists, because I understand that they fundamentally feel that needs to be said up front and unashamedly. It's not.
I don't have. I mean, it's not my angle either. But I was certainly open to working with people who call themselves anti-feminists. You know what I mean? I didn't want to not put those events into the Equalogist. I would have to say that up to this date, the Equalogist is largely a failure. Because it hasn't captured those, in order to succeed, it would have to be distributed to the membership to, a significant number of men's issues mailing lists, and it isn't. So, well, we'll see where it goes. Maybe a Twitter approach, but.
This is a good time to mention, and I'll say this again at the end of the interview, if people do want to sign up for the Equalogist, I'll leave details.
For those of you viewers who haven't seen it, I tried to start off with 2 or 3 bits of positive news. I mean, obviously, at the moment, you have to really scratch for it, but let's at least notice the odd positive thing which is happening. Like the fact that the domestic abuse bill remains ungendered. I mean, that's not much. It was originally not gendered, and it remains not gendered. Well, I think that's a positive move. It means that forces in the House of Commons who wanted to make it gendered failed. The government actually brought in a 3-line whip to oppose them. That's amazing. So, and then other things, obviously the original intention was to have the events, but there haven't been very many of those with COVID. But, then a book or a video or an article or a campaign or an organization, just with this idea of get more people to know what other people are doing, to build this sense of a movement. So I'm glad that it's something which you've found useful. The other thing I do is try to steer well clear of the negative, if you know what I mean. I don't really want to do much bashing, because I don't think that works. I think.
Yeah, I'd be inclined to agree that plain and simple bashing rarely achieves very much at all, and all too often simply hands your opponent an easy shot at goal. Anyway, my thanks to Mike for a fascinating chat, and as promised, there are plenty of links in the show notes for you to find out more about his work, including links to the Equi-Law Uk website, a direct link to the sign-up page for those of you who want to receive a regular copy of the Equalogist, and a link to Mike's donate page for anyone who wants to help directly support his work. I'll also include a link to Gender Parity UK's Twitter feed, so be sure to follow developments about that exciting new initiative. And finally, one of the first projects to come out of Gender Parity UK's productivity over the summer is a new regular men's rights discussion show on YouTube called MR Radio. It's hosted by two previous guests of this series, namely Philip Tanzer and Elizabeth Hobson, alongside a very talented chap called The Eccentric Hat. And episodes 1 to 3 are available now. And if you haven't already, I'd encourage you to add them to your playlist, because I think it's really important that we support new initiatives promoting positive perspectives on men's issues, and actively encouraging people to do something about the significant number of structural and attitudinal barriers impacting on boys and men. I'll be back soon for another hopefully fascinating conversation, and in the meantime, all that's left for me to say is a massive thank you once again to today's guest, Mike Bell. Thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed this content, you can help support this channel by liking, subscribing, leaving a comment, and sharing this video far and wide. And of course, and as always, if you see an elephant,
can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.
The Glass Blind Spot is brought to you by you, because it's your views, your likes and your comments that keep this show on the road.